I really feel like we need to make sure that boys and men have the supports that they need. I don't feel like this gets enough attention, and I don't feel like those topics are even talked about.
Before hearing my presentation to the Rural Education Center, was the idea of advocacy focused on the male population something that was on your radar at all?
Not at all. No. But as soon as I heard it, I thought this makes a lot of sense because there are advocates for all other sorts of groups. And I feel like, especially with the the amount of division there is right now over gender issues, it resonates with me personally to have advocates who speak up for the unique position that men and boys hold in society.
You have worked for many years of your career prior to the position you're in now with youth that have been in pretty serious trouble. Institutionalized, right? In the sense of a JR stands for juvenile rehabilitation, right?
That's correct.
Can you talk about how long you did that work and whether some of what you observed has influenced your enthusiasm for supporting what I'm up to with advocacy for boys and men?
Yes, it does. And I have grandsons myself, and they have struggles too. I worked for over 15 years in juvenile court services, so juvenile probation, and worked closely with local detention facility and juvenile rehabilitation within the state, and saw lots of youth, primarily young men, who spent a lot of time in detention and then were also sent to juvenile rehabilitation. There's more work on the front end, the upstream work that we could be doing to hopefully prevent a lot of young people from going down that road. And again, it is primarily affecting young men. Something that I saw was young men who have personal struggles, have lots of trauma in their history. They don't have access to resources. They don't have maybe nuclear families with an adult role model who is in their life. And that's probably the number one factor that I would see where my personal interest comes into this is seeing that so many young men don't have an adult male role model in their personal life. And I believe that has a lot to do with why they head down this road. And I worked with young men, usually no less than 12 months at a time. You have a high level of knowledge about their home life and their family and the reality of what their situation is. And often, and it's not always, but often it's a single family, a single parent family. And mentor programs is probably the number one intervention that we miss in so many of our communities is having adult role models, and particularly adult role models who match the sex of the youth, to be a mentor for them, to teach them what it means to hold a role as a young man in a family, and as you grow, what those regular typical behaviors and roles look like.
Do you have a sense of whether there's a lack of mentorship type programs, or if it's primarily a lack of the ability to recruit enough people to be those mentors?
They feed into each other, but it's the first piece of that. There are no mentorship programs, not in rural communities, and if there are so few, they're hard to even hear about or find. Do I think that recruiting would become an issue? Absolutely. But I also know that, there have been some really great programs people have instituted in the past, just that you hear about through the years and you read about, that have been very successful. But we need those in every community. We need those in schools. We need those not just for kids going through criminal proceedings or court processes. We need them available to kids who are struggling.
Did you know that there's a Washington State Fatherhood Council that's actually like basically a project of the Department of Social and Health Services where there's actually two staff that are dedicated to this Fatherhood Council?
No, and that's another thing I would hope gets brought up is educating people on what is already out there, what exists, and how we can tie the work together with then grassroots efforts in communities.
Yeah, there's not many people playing this kind of advocacy networking role. So I love that I get to do that.
Well, I'm glad that you're doing it because in the work that I have always done, one of the things that brings me the most joy or the most satisfaction is filling the gaps where they're so easy to fill, but people just don't realize it's just a gap of information. Like all we need to do is connect the right people. Those things exist out there most of the time, and it's just people aren't aware of them and they don't know who the people are. So if I can connect the right person with the other right person, that's the best thing I can do all day long. That's what I feel like.
What you're up to at ESD 101 has to do with violence prevention. Can you talk about that?
The education system has 9 educational service districts within the state. And so within each of those regional offices, we have what's called a regional school safety center. And those are a team of people who work in behavioral health. So helping to provide substance use, suicide prevention, and mental health, connecting people with resources. We have someone on the team who does comprehensive school safety coordination, which is the physical safety measures and helping with school drills and emergency operations plans. And then we have threat assessment coordinators who help. It's a prevention tool to hopefully prevent violence from happening in our schools. It is somewhat of a response as well because we do use that after someone has said or done something that's alarming other people around them. Hopefully, as we educate people more and move forward in this work, it will become a true prevention model where people will share the concerning information that they hear and see ahead of time before anything happens that puts a young person on the radar of law enforcement or a criminal investigation, because that really is the goal and how to keep kids in school through the use of threat assessment. So if we're using it properly, we should hopefully be able to prevent criminal investigations the majority of the time and also keep kids in school, which is a huge protective factor in any young person's life.
I suppose that the dreaded American school shooting is the highest profile example of school violence. What else falls under school violence that's on your radar that people don't think of as much?
You know, any form of violence is on our radar, and we talk a lot about the different types of violence that we see. Reactive violence happens every day in schools because young people don't always have the skills to handle the situations that they find themselves in and they act out. We do still do safety planning and create supervision plans for those behaviors, but we're really trying to identify, is targeted violence, are we seeing a threat for targeted violence, and to stop those acts because those acts are the ones that bring devastation and lifetime consequences. So acts involving school shootings or bombings, those kinds of larger events. Reactive violence happens more frequently, but there's less of a chance that someone will be significantly injured or have a fatal injury, whereas targeted violence happens much less frequently, but the outcome can be much more severe. And targets can be an institution, they can be a group of people, it could be an individual.
Okay. We probably talked about this some when we met, but there are still a few bills that are alive in the state legislature that include the term gender-based violence. And since we're on the topic of violence, I was curious to ask, in the school system in which you work, is gender-based violence a terminology that's used?
Nope, not that I've heard, not at this point.
Okay. Do you know what that term refers to when used by Washington state officials?
I would know, to answer your question directly, no, but I could give it a guess. And I would imagine it has to do with the assumption that certain acts are tied either to males or females.
One of the things we talked about when we spoke before was the topic of Job Corps. Can you talk about what Job Corps is?
Well, Job Corps is an organization that has facilities throughout the United States. Gosh, I wish I could tell you the year that it began. It once had the stigma and probably still has a little bit of a stigma of being for difficult youth or youth who kind of were given that chance of, in court that you go this route or you're going to detention. And that isn't necessarily the case. But essentially, what Job Corps amounts to now is like a 2-year paid full tuition, room and board scholarship. So the program, you pick the program that you are interested in, and then you can see at all of the locations that that particular program is offered throughout the United States, and you can choose the location you choose to go to. You do have to wait for an opening in that program at that location, but you would be able to access that program in the area that you hope to access it, and they pay for the program, your room and board. And back when I was working with Job Corps, they sent you home twice a year to be with your family. But they do have a policy that's very strict on substance use. And if you use, and you always get UA'd when you come back to the program, if you're positive, it's a one and done, you're out. And so that's a really tough lesson. Maybe, always hoped to make sure that message was received loud and clear by kids who were going to Job Corps, but I think it's a fantastic program. It does have some income limitations for people who meet those brackets would qualify then to access the um, the programs. But I think it's a wonderful program, uh, of vocational. There is some academic component to it too, because you can finish your GED and then you would go into a vocational training. And so the vocational trainings might be up to 1 year, and then you can choose to stay or go to a different location for maybe an advanced training or a second um, field of training. And so you can be in the program for up to 2 years. And I think the ages where it's for youth who are 16 to 24 years old. So it doesn't just cut off when a youth becomes the age of adulthood. People can access that program until they're 24. You can't be on court supervision, I think, was one of the caveats. You can have a felony, I believe, in that program, but you can't be on court supervision when you go. So,
So the way that one could be a you could be that young and have a felony and not be on court supervision is that the felony happens and then there's some period where you're supervised and then that period ends and now you're eligible.
correct.
Okay.